Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of From the Mount, a podcast from the campus of Mount Perrin Christian School. I'm the host of From the Mount, Steve Kyle. Glad to be with you for another episode. Just a thank you to those who are listening. Some of you listen to every episode, whether you like the content or not. So thanks for listening. And I also, at the end of at least our most recent ones, have posted, we do have an email address directly for our podcast. So if you're listening and you have show ideas or even questions about shows we've done, I always encourage our listeners to just email me directly at fromthemount@mtperrinschool.com. That's fromthemount@mtperrinschool.com. And then you can ask questions, whether it's about episodes we've had or you want an episode to us to do one. All you got to do is email. So if you've read the description, you know that today's episode is on neurodiversity. Now, if you're a regular listener, you may have already listened to an episode we did, and we could 100% do probably 10 episodes on this and include these two fantastic ladies I have on the show today with me. Both of them are first-time guests on the podcast, so I am so excited anytime we have first-time guests. And these two ladies are pretty smart ladies. They do a lot of presenting for our faculty and staff, and always impressed with the work you ladies do. But I would love to welcome to the show Miss Jessica Robbins and Miss Jubilee Rowland.
Hi.
Hi.
Good morning.
Welcome. Yeah. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, whenever you're listening. But we're recording this actually fairly early in the morning here. And ladies, it's going to be great. It's going to be a great episode where I always learn stuff. And again, you guys have done some things for our faculty and staff that I've walked away from myself and thought, that's great stuff. It's rich. It's and it's a subject that I think hits home with so many parents of school-age children. Well, really, I think any age, but it's an important one. So we're going to be talking about neurodiversity. But before we dig into that, I want our audience to meet you and to learn a little bit about each of you. And Jubilee, I'm going to start with you. Give us a quick background. Who is Jubilee? How long you been in education? What qualifies me to even listen to you, Jubilee?
I'm Jubilee Rowland. This is my 12th year in education. And I think one of my most identifying features is that I'm a Christian school teacher. I grew up in Christian schools. It has made a profound impact on my faith. I just watched teachers who really love Jesus, a lot of different teachers, show me what faith looks like when you embody it with your whole life, whether that be your vocation or who you are as a parent. Speaking of parenthood, I have 3 children, 3 and under. I have a 3-year-old, and then I have 2-year-old twins. And that has also profoundly impacted who I am as an educator. I work in high school directed studies, so every single child that I interact with is neurodiverse, whether that is dyslexia or dyscalculia or has ADHD or slow processing. Everybody learns different than your typical learner. So that's who I am as an educator.
Great. Jessica, how long you been here at Mount Perrin?
This is my 4th school year here.
School year. All right. Jessica.
Hi, I am Jessica Robbins. I am a middle school directed studies teacher. This is my 9th year at Mount Perrin. It's my 11th year as a parent, and then my 9th year on staff here. I started in the school directed studies program, and this is my 3rd year in the middle school. I have an 8th grader at Mount Perrin, Kate. She's who brought us over to Mount Perrin. And then I have a 2nd grader, Zachary. And Kate is actually neurodiverse. And I do the same thing as Jubilee in terms of with the directed studies program. All of our learners are neurodiverse.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, I was waiting. I was like, oh, she's going to bring something else. So, and just a quick thing. Obviously, at Mount Perrin, we have what is called a directed studies program. And real quick, when we say directed studies at Mount Perrin, what exactly? Try to give me a 30-second. What is our directed studies program, if I'm listening, what does that actually mean?
I think Jessica can speak to that more
Great.
than I can because she's a veteran teacher in the program.
Got it. So Jessica, I'm a parent. I'm like, directed. I've heard of it, but and again, I think they kind of figure it out. But I really want people to understand because this is not normal in Christian schools. I've worked at 5 in 30 years. This is the only one that's had any program, anything like this, and it's a pretty advanced program, and it's packed. We could grow it even more. What is the directed studies program in a nutshell?
Yeah, we are designed to support the neurodiverse student. We have students with anxiety, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia. We start in the lower school. They provide reading support and math support as well as some remediation. In the middle school, we do a lot of content support and executive functioning support, and that's true to the high school too. Lower school, it's really teaching and remediating and doing some enrichment. In middle school, it's the same. We have small group classes as well as team talk classes. And then as they graduate into school and move through the program, it turns more into a content support and executive functioning study hall. So directed studies, it's kind of the name says it. We're helping the students to direct their studies in order for them to be successful learners in the general education classroom.
Yeah. And it's more than just, hey, we're sharing with them documents. I mean, you guys are working with students. There's dedicated spaces on campus for this to happen, for students to come. We have how many total staff in our directed studies program total?
So there are 4 high school teachers, middle school teachers. How many lower school teachers are there?
I think there's 5 or 6.
Yeah. So you're looking at what, 12 or so, essentially full-time staff that are part of a directed studies program. That's their primary focus, and that's a big deal because again, one, it shows the importance of it, but number two, the fact that this is not just a small select group of we've got 12 dedicated teachers because we've got 3 or 4 kids that need a little extra help. Not at all. It's a robust program because we desire that our students are successful. And the students that have some learning differences are identified and worked with for their success, and it's an amazing program that we offer here. So I think we've already alluded to it, but what type of let's actually go before that. In case this is the only episode you've listened to, when we mean neurodiverse, and I know most people go, of course I know what that means. Maybe most, but someone's like, I'm still not exactly sure what you mean when you say a neurodiverse student. Aren't we all neurodiverse people, learners?
Yes, we all learn differently. So we're not talking about whether you learn kinesthetically or you learn visually. We're talking more about learning truly being challenging. So let's say a child is 5. By 5, you should be able to, list 3 words that rhyme. So we start seeing indicators and markers of children who learn language differently. When we are talking about children who learn math differently, we're thinking you all have an internal number line. So some way in your head you can picture that 5 is a bigger number than 1. So we start seeing when kids are little that really just the idea of 10 is just not sticking in their head. Or when you say the words multiply, they're like, wait, how is multiplying different than adding? Isn't that just making numbers different? So we start seeing a lot of those kinds of differences when we talk about difference.
Got it. And so we've already mentioned, I think both of you now have mentioned when we talk about what types of neurodiverse students, you've mentioned, I'm just drawing a blank on your like dyslexic, but for somebody who might not know what some of those words, like if I'm dyslexic, what does that actually mean? Because most people are like, oh, you just you see words backwards. If you have, so really quick, of the major ones we see, what is it and what are they, if that makes sense?
So we see dyslexia, which is you learn to read differently. So it means that the part of your brain that most people use to learn to read is not the one that you use. So you're pulling from more parts of your brain to learn to read. We talk about dyscalculia, which is really a math learning disorder. We see dysgraphia, which means that the way that your brain communicates with your hand, which communicates with the page, is just different than your typical person. It takes a lot more practice for that child to learn to write because the mechanics of writing are different. It's not sloppy handwriting. It truly is the mechanics of learning to write the word neurodiverse is just different.
Yeah. So good. And again, I think that helps people to think. And so I'm a parent or an educator, whatever it is. And I'm going, all right, I get you. I'm with you. How do I know? Like, what are the external markers? What are the things that I would be looking for in, let's say, a middle school student that would go, I think we may have a learning difference here with any one of these. Would there be some middle school examples that a teacher or even a parent would be able to see, Jessica?
Yeah, I was gonna talk about my daughter Kate. Before I came to Mount Perrin, I worked in the general education classroom as a high school math teacher. And I came here, my first year teaching here in the Directed Studies program was when Kate was in kindergarten. And with Kate, she is, I think people hear ADHD and they think of a child like bouncing off the walls and not listening and running around. And that's not what a learning difference looks like at all. I think a lot of times learning differences are confused with being apathetic or that they don't care about doing the work. And when I started learning more about diverse learners as a staff member and as a teacher, I really started looking at my own child and I thought, wow, I wonder if this is what's going on. With Kate, she wanted to please. She was a pleasing child. When you gave her positive reinforcement or praise, she was so happy. So when she would come home and, the color chart, she would have to clip from green to yellow to red. I was, as a parent, kind of obsessed with asking her, well, what color did you land on today? And to a pleasing child who worked so hard to please, ending up on orange or red, I remember punishing her. And I remember, as a parent, I didn't let her go to a birthday party. And it haunts me to this day. It was, 8 years ago. I was basing her family time and her free time on how she behaved in school. And it took me a while to learn as a parent that she could not help it. Kate is twice exceptional. And that's the other thing. I didn't think she had ADHD because everyone told me how bright she was and how well she performed. But she is ADHD inattentive. So the typical markers and what you see was not there with her. She wasn't running around. She wasn't defying the teacher. She was just kind of zoning out and not taking direction the first time. And it took me having this job to realize that my child might be neurodiverse. And that's when we went into the world of testing and having a psychologist maybe figure out what is going on with her. So as a parent, I think a lot of it is faith and the Holy Spirit. But a lot of it too is saying, these things that the teacher is saying about my child just don't sound like their personality. I think my child enjoys school. I think they want to be able to read. I think they want to be able to follow directions. So I think with a lot of prayer, it was, it's changed our life.
Yeah.
And it's changed my daughter's life. So I think that answered your question
Yeah,
about what
yeah.
a parent might see.
And would you add anything, Jubilee, like you work with high school, but obviously some of these markers and identifiers. So I'm a parent and I'm listening to this and I'm going, are there quickly like some things? Not that if they're like, oh, well, if your kid comes home and he has 3 or more times where the teacher has to email you about his behavior, he must be neurodiverse or have a learning difference. That might be true, but are there things that a parent might go, oh, that's worth actually looking into?
So when a child has ADHD, you would look at things like, 3-step directions. Okay, I need you to brush your teeth, put on your pants, and brush your hair. A child might only be able to do one of those things because remembering the 3-step directions might be really, really difficult. So that child's not defiant. They truly cannot remember what it is that you asked them
Yeah.
to do. Okay, when it comes to spelling, it's really just they have a hard time moving from phonetic spelling to actually conventional, this is the way I should be spelling. It's a difference in being able to move from, solving problems using addition to solving problems using multiplication, right? When you get to algebra, it's a difference between, oh, I just know that this must be the answer for what the value of X is. But, a child might just always be adding instead of actually solving that problem correctly. So you start seeing a lot of those kinds of differences. And it's also, hey, well, you just need to try harder in school. Well, I just can't read fast. I just can't sound out the words fast enough to make meaning of what I'm reading. And most kids cannot articulate that. It manifests as frustration, starting to not like school, starting to feel low self-worth because they start thinking, well, I'm just stupid. And that's just not true. We have schoolers who, they have dyslexia and they've learned a lot of compensatory skills. I have a student who, if he has a good teacher who can present things to him in many different ways, you might find out that he learns primarily through listening because reading truly is that difficult, right? Or kids who just read out loud very poorly, right? They have to sound everything out. So, they might every single time they see the word official, they'll probably read it as office. And you're like, no, just actually look at the word. They're like, well, officer, because it's just reading the whole word with fluency is just difficult.
Yeah.
So as a parent, it just looks like you can't remember math facts. You can't remember your spelling words. You can't solve problems the way your teacher wants you to solve them. You can't remember multi-step directions. And it also looks like immaturity. So a 14-year-old who behaves like a 10-year-old because there's actually something different about their brain that they truly cannot help. It also manifests sometimes as learning emotions slower, right? So your kid who's having a hard time moving beyond mad, sad, glad, right? They're having a hard time with empathy because they can't attend to a conversation long enough to realize oh, this person is feeling really sad because of X, Y, and Z things.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting is you touch on a lot, and we might not even have time to get into, and certainly I think what complicates this even more today, of course, is when you consider things like technology and cell phones, and because I do think that there's an impact, one, on identifying what is a learning difference and something within, or somebody who might be distracted, or is things like technology contributing to those things. And that's probably a whole nother episode because I think there's so many variables that come into play there. So let's talk then about this. When you see neurodiversity, we're looking at it within the context of the classroom, but where else might you how else does it have an impact on the whole of a child? You've got athletes, they're involved in things at their church. What are other ways that this impacts? Because it's not just the classroom that you begin to see this kind of impact, that it impacts them. Where else and where else might you see and what kind of impact would it have outside the classroom?
I think you're right, especially if we talk about athletics. If you have a cheerleader and they're learning a routine and the coach keeps telling them to go left and they just keep going right. With football or other sports, when you're trying to learn a specific series or a specific play, they would probably have a hard time learning that route or learning that play based on the sequencing as well as the directions. Like Jubilee said, I need you to brush your teeth, put on your shoes, and clean your room before we go. And 15 minutes goes by and you walk upstairs and they're just now brushing their teeth. I used to equate it a lot of times with ADHD. It's like as an adult, when we go into the pantry and we forget what we went in there for, if we stand there for a second, we usually remember and grab it and keep going, or we have to find something to trigger what we forgot. That's a lot of times how these kids live their life.
Yeah.
They're in the pantry and they've forgotten what they were supposed to do, and it just where with us, our brains are able to compensate. Sometimes they just might not ever remember why they went in that pantry
Yeah.
and without redirection or help.
Yeah, it's always the cookies though is why I go in. So I make it easy. I'm like, it's the cookies.
It's
That's
the
why
cookie.
that's why I'm here. Even if I'm not there for the cookies, it's always that's a great place to go when in doubt. So there's obviously these impacts, but I want you to now how does it impact them individually? Because obviously this has a profound impact on their self-image, the way that they see themselves, the way they see the world, the way they see. What's interesting is the way they often talk about each other in this kind of thing. So what other ways and impacts is this having on them? Not only like I'm really struggling in class and I feel discouraged, my grades might be lower right now, but I also blank high school and middle school. Where Jubilee, how is that having an impact on them as an individual?
So sometimes I see students who are neurodiverse having a hard time keeping up with the pace of conversation, which then impacts their friendships, which then makes them maybe take on the identity of the class clown or something like that, because truly some kids have a hard time keeping up with the pace of conversation, right? Like you ask them a question or like there's a group of friends and they're talking about, let's say, homecoming, and everybody can talk about their dress or how they're going to get ready or what they hope the music is like. And by the time maybe a child who has a processing disorder wants to add their conversation or add their piece to the conversation's already moved on, right? So then they feel like I'm not good at making friends. So it impacts kids a lot of times socially. And then you start thinking, well, I can't make friends. Well, maybe something's wrong with me. And I think sometimes when well-intentioned parents don't share with their child, like, these are what your diagnoses are, then a child just thinks that something's wrong.
Yeah.
Or I'm just less than, or I'm just worse. No, your brain works differently, and different isn't bad, right?
Yeah.
Like God has made us all different. And I think it's an embracing of that difference of, yeah, I have dyslexia, but I still learn to read. I can still, use these other skills and these other giftings, right? And I tell students often, like, I'm a teacher because I'm really good at school. Let's just be frank. Like, this is where God has gifted me. So this is what I'm choosing to do with my life. And I think sometimes it affects a child in that, like, God, why'd you make me this way? Or
Yeah.
God, did you mess up? And it's helping kids understand that, no, God didn't mess you up, right? He just gave you gifts that are different, probably not in the area of school, but you're not messed up.
Yeah. You're not dumb. I would hear students when you do that. We're in the dumb class. We're not the smart. Oh, we're not. Well, we're not in that honors class. Over the years of me doing that, you hear the kids begin to even talk about themselves that way. Well, I'm just in the dumb class, or we're not the smart kids. We're not the. And even before, and with my lack, I don't operate in neurodiverse and learning different spaces in the sense of as an expert or a teacher. But even then, wait a minute, that is so far from the truth. Learning different is not dumb. Not being in AP and honors level classes makes you no less of, or and it does, and that begins to impact the self-image. You mentioned it rightfully so, the way every child is created uniquely as an image bearer of God himself. And so these differences aren't differences to be, minimized or ridiculed for. But and what's interesting is oftentimes you see those who might, hey, I struggle in this particular math or the language arts area, but they have a gifting in some other places that is this amazing, beautiful way in which they see the world, that God has said, yeah, this is exactly how I've made you. yeah, you don't process the way, but, being, all A's in every class, that's boring anyway. Then it's no fun. I'm just kidding. Maybe it is. That wasn't me. Maybe it is fun to have all A's, but,
I wanted to add to that. Um, they a lot of times are self-deprecating as a defense mechanism. I'm going to say it about myself before someone else says it about me. And one of the things we try to do as directed studies teachers, and I think at Mount Paran Christian School, because we are the hands and feet of Jesus with these students, I think our faculty and staff is amazing at this. We kind of call them out on that and say, you are not dumb. These students, if you think about it, I'm older than Jubilee. I'm in my 40s, but I've lived a lot of life in 45 years, and these students who are 8 and 13 and 17, I mean, their whole life has only been about school. This is all they've known. And what they don't understand is that after they get out of this box that is the general education classroom, these learning diverse students are going to go on to do amazing things. Dyslexia is thinking out of the box. Dyslexia, if you look at all of the innovators of our lifetime, all of the scientists, inventors, so many of them are dyslexic because they have a way of thinking that the neurotypical person can't. And with ADHD, I always laugh that I have to pause the remote. I have to pause the TV if I want to send a text message because I can't do two things at once. Meanwhile, someone with ADHD who's a parent can be cooking the casserole and tying their kid's shoe and helping the other kid with homework all at one time without batting an eye. And it's important to celebrate those other gifts that they have. And that's one of the things in the middle school directed studies that we charge them with is just because you're neurodiverse and you struggle in the classroom doesn't mean that you're any less important to God's kingdom. And I often share with them, the verse I use a lot with them is 1 Peter 4:10, and it says, each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful steward of God's grace in its various forms. And that's kind of, we want to empower them as a parent, as a teacher, as a friend. Just because you can't get an A on a spelling test doesn't mean that you're not meant for great things and you weren't built. As God has made you exactly how he wants you to be, and he has great things for you.
Yeah. So if I'm listening as a parent, and maybe I don't have, or at least I'm not aware at this moment, I have a neurodiverse student. Like I'm listening going, you've mentioned a few things I've seen or I've heard. As a parent, what would be my next, like, what do I do, with this info that I've listened and I'm like, okay, I think I might have a child that might be neurodiverse. I don't know. I'm no expert. What would you say to that parent listening right now? What would be next steps? What would you encourage them to do, in this lower school? It doesn't matter, I think, at this point, what grade they're in. I would assume at least the initial stages are going to be the same. What would you recommend they do?
I think a lot of times teachers, they can share what they see, right? But as a parent, you can probably see a trend, right? In first grade, okay, they just ask really different questions. You're trying to teach them about how plants grow, and they're looking out the window wondering, like, does it work for every plant, right? But I think parents are really good at seeing trends because you've seen them and who they are from first grade through sixth grade. So I think a lot of it is sharing with teachers, hey, this is what we saw in third grade. Do you have any recommendations? And sometimes teachers and administration will recommend, I think you need to see a psychologist, because then they'll do a whole battery of tests and they'll say, well, how is your reading fluency? Like how fast do you read? Or let's see how you do in math, or let's see how your memory is. So then a psychologist will be able to like paint you a bigger picture and also help a parent interpret those findings and kind of synthesize and make sense of the learner that their child is. And at that point, then you might have a diagnosis, and then you might have recommendations of how you might level the playing field, right? So then you start hearing about things like accommodations. Well, Sally gets extended time. I want that for my child, Johnny. Um, and it's knowing that, well, Sally getting extended time is really just giving her a stool so that she can see over the fence. It's not really giving her an advantage, right? So I think it's maybe three things. It's identifying trends that you've seen as a parent. It's asking teachers, like, what is it that you see? And then if a teacher recommends, well, maybe, let's explore this further with psych ed testing, it's getting your child tested, looking at those accommodations. Sometimes, like, believing that this is who God made your kid to be, and then, pursuing those accommodations, being okay with your child being in directed studies because that's the space that they'll learn in best.
Yeah, not being afraid of that and thinking there's something wrong with, or there's my child's broken, or I didn't want to have the child who had to have this kind, that all that kind of stuff is really selfish, and it only really actually thinks of the parent, not the child. It's, well, I'm worried about what people might think about me, my parenting, my child, forget all that. Let's focus on the well-being of your child, identifying, are they, and again, there's so many variables that come into play. And so that's why going to the experts and saying, hey, can we at least run some tests? The tests don't mean, oh my goodness, that means for the rest of my life, my child's now going to have to be, this and have to go. No, not at all. It's going to develop a baseline of where are they? And maybe are there some things we can do to help? And sometimes it's only for a period of time. Sometimes it's not a lifelong, like, oh, wow, this is how you're going to be. You're going to always struggle with this kind of thing. A lot of these students develop lots of habits, and they learn tools and things that help them. True, that this isn't necessarily like the way you are now. And again, not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's not like this life sentence of just a life of struggle, never being able to read. Like, no, not at all. There are times and periods and developmentally where we are both physiologically and in our brain development and so if you're a parent, but focus on what's going to be best for your child is the primary thing, not how it might look.
And I think one thing that I'd like to add to that is, let's say your child has a lisp, right? If your child then goes to see a speech therapist, that person is then an expert in the field of how to help your child with speaking clearly. Or let's say your child is diagnosed with dyslexia, right? There are very specific reading strategies that a reading specialist can use to teach that child to become a fluent reader. And many of our students who, let's say, have a diagnosis of dyslexia in second grade, if they are appropriately remediated when they get their next, psych ed test in fifth or sixth grade, sometimes dyslexia doesn't show up on the screen anymore because a reading specialist has intervened and has done so many of those strategies with the kid that they're like, okay, these are my word attack strategies. So I think a lot of times these things can be remediated. Or let's say a child has ADHD, that probably will always show up on their screen. But then they're like, oh, if I have to remember to do my homework, I need to make a list.
Yeah.
This is what I need to do now. This is what's coming up on the horizon. And I think a lot of those things are things that your typical learner will just pick up on, but they have to be many times explicitly taught to a child who has a learning difference.
Yeah,
right.
For sure. Yeah.
Well, and I think to add to that, one thing that we see coming out of our graduates from the Directed Studies program over and over again is the skills they've acquired and what they've struggled with and how they've overcome that. Our children are leaving this program as resilient, educated, strong young adults, and it's amazing to see. So I don't want any parent to think that a diagnosis is anything. It can be a struggle, and it can be a challenge, and it can be hard during these formative years. But the child of God that has been created is going to be so strong when they walk out of that general education scenario that they're going to be unstoppable as an adult.
Yeah. And I think that's when you think of that, and if you're a parent of a neurodiverse student, you hopefully are encouraged when you hear that to know that. If you are the parent of a neurodiverse student, one with maybe learning differences, you look at that and hopefully recognize there is nothing wrong. You guys have both said this on this podcast. There's nothing wrong with your child. Quite to the contrary. They're created exactly the way. There's no surprise there. It's no, well, God messed up. He forgot something. He didn't finish. He didn't. No, this is exactly the person that he created for a very particular divine purpose. And you guys get the privilege of seeing that in a unique and special way here. But if you're the parent of somebody or another educator particularly, we have this awesome opportunity to just be encouragers in these spaces to these students by reminding them that they are uniquely created by God, not broken or, unfinished, but exactly the way, and that every learner, even not the quote neurodiverse or has adjustments and ways in which they learn best. Theirs is just different. And that's all. And I hopefully, if you've listened to this episode, you've gotten that, and you're encouraged to either take next steps. You're encouraged to encourage your neighbor who's been asking questions about this to maybe do that thing, and you've learned a little bit more about neurodiversity and the amazing program we have right here at Mount Perrin. And so, Jessica, Jubilee, thank you guys so much for sharing this rich information. You're going to be back on because there is so much to talk about really specifically as it relates to this stuff, but it's been great having you guys on here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you guys for listening to another episode of From the Mount.